Welcome back to What You Need to Know for Audio Engineers. This video is about reverb. I'm not going to go in depth about reverb in this video because everyone knows what reverb is. It's the sound of reflections. It's the sound of space. It's the sound of a room. I'm just going to make sure that we are covering all of our bases as far as the controls that we have over this aspect of physics, reverb, the controls that we have over that when we are mixing and the ones that we want to pay attention to. So the first of these controls is the mix control. The mix is how much reverb you hear. My voice, as an example right now, travels to the walls, is reflected, comes back again, and since my voice is closer to the microphone that's recording this right now, the amount of my voice that you hear is more than the amount of reverb. So the mix is essentially the volume of the dry signal versus the volume of the wet signal. Eventually, the sound stops reverberating. The reflections die. They are diffused. And the amount of time that it takes for that to happen is called the decay time. As far as natural rooms go, this is a pretty big room, and there's not an incredibly long decay on it, but that's something that kind of depends on the space. And then the pre-delay is the final thing, and that's just the amount of time it takes for the sound to travel out to a surface, for it to reflect off of that surface, and for it to return again. That's the pre-delay. This is affected by how far away the surface is, which the sound is reflecting off of. So if you have a wall that's 10 feet in front of you and you speak in front of that wall, the pre-delay is going to be relatively short, compared to if you have a wall that is 100 feet away and you speak. You have to speak pretty loudly, but you speak, and then it will take a lot longer for the sound to travel to that wall and for it to bounce back again. So next, pre and post EQ. EQ plays a big part in reverb. So we can EQ the sound before it enters the reverb at the EQ, and then we can also EQ the sound of the reverb. Next, different kinds of reverbs will have different parameters. You might see a diffusion parameter, you might see modulation, tape modulation, vibrato, chorus, phasing, flanging, or shimmer. We can have lots of different kinds of modulations on reverb. And all of those basically sound completely unrealistic. They're very effect-oriented reverbs. So, potential problems with reverb. The main problem with reverb is intelligibility. So let's take a vocal, for example. If we take a vocal and we crank the reverb way up, and let's say we have a really long decay time and a significant pre-delay of maybe 100 milliseconds. That is significant. That's a very reverby reverb. It's going to be really hard to hear the lyrics of the vocal. We need to be very conservative with our mix settings, with the decay of the reverb, and the pre-delay of the reverb. All of these things affect intelligibility massively, but also they're all needed. We need all of these things in order for a vocal to sound realistic, for it to sound three-dimensional, for it to sound good. We need reverb, but we can go too far with it very easily. Crank up the mix too high, we've lost our intelligibility. If we have a super long decay of 10 seconds long, then the first word that they sing is reflecting and reverbing for 10 seconds, while in the meantime they're saying, they've gone on to the chorus by that time, and the verse is still reverberating. We don't want that to happen. That will reduce intelligibility and will contribute to a bad sounding mix. Same goes for pre-delay. If we set the pre-delay too long, then we're going to be hearing delays of the word that they said, a couple words ago. Lyrics can happen a lot faster than pre-delay can happen. So we need to make sure that our pre-delay is not too long. Short enough, but not too short. Long enough, but not too long. And EQ also plays a big part in this kind of intelligibility thing. So we need to use EQ to cut out a whole bunch of low end. We need to use EQ to cut out mid-range frequencies that are interfering with the vocals. We need to cut high frequencies that are lasting a little bit too long and are fatiguing or annoying to listen to. We need to be very careful with our EQ of our reverb because getting it right, it sounds right. Getting it wrong, it's never going to quite sound right, and sometimes it can sound pretty hard to listen to. Right, here's the reverb that we just used yesterday on Sunday morning for the guitars. The electric and acoustic guitar both ran through this reverb here. On the top, we can see there's the pre-delay control. That's set to 44 milliseconds. And right next to that is the decay time, 2.5 seconds. So the only control that's missing from this is the mix control. And since this is on an effects return from an auxiliary send, we would actually use the faders on the soundboard to mix the reverb in. So our mix control is not here, it's at the faders. After the decay time, there's the high frequency decay and a high frequency slope. This is basically kind of like an EQ control. It is affecting how long the high frequencies last in the reverb. So the high frequencies are decaying at a different time than the low frequencies, basically, and the point at which the high frequencies start to decay differently is that high frequency decay point, the 5.2 kilohertz. And then the slope is, well, how drastically the high frequencies decay compared to the low frequencies. Down on the left corner, you can see the low frequency cut set to about 300 hertz, and next to that, the high frequency cut set to 10.2 kilohertz. So these are filter controls. Basically, they're post-EQ controls. They are EQing the reverb. Down at the very bottom, across the bottom, you can see LF, LM, HM, and HF. Those are the 4 bands of our parametric EQ. That's our actual post-EQ module that is attached to the effects return. And that is also, you can see, cutting some mid-range frequencies. There is a couple of controls there where it says expert, and then there's diffusion and size. It says reflections and reflection detail right there. These are the extra parameters that I basically said to ignore, but you can see that those are there, and there are many more of them. It says expert for a reason. You only really get into those kinds of parameters once you are really into reverb and you care about really crafting the sound of the reverb. For yesterday, for service, I wasn't really interested in crafting the sound of the reverb. I was interested in just getting a really basic reverb that sounded good, that would place the guitars in a space to give them some ambience.